Chapter 8. Third year of the war, investment of Plataea, naval victories of Phormio, Thracian eruption into Macedonia. The next summer, the Peloponnesians and their allies, instead of invading Attica, marched against Plataea, under the command of Archidamus, son of Thucydides, king of the Lacedaemonians. He had encamped his army and was about to lay waste the country when the Plataeans hastened to send envoys to him and spoke as follows. Archidamus and Lacedaemonians, in invading the Plataean territory, you do what is wrong in itself and worthy neither of yourselves nor of the fathers who begot you. Pausanias, son of Cleombrotus, your countryman, after freeing Hellas from the Medes with the help of those Hellenes who were willing to undertake the risk of the battle fought near our city, offered sacrifice to Zeus the Liberator in the marketplace of Plataea, and calling all the allies together, restored to the Plataeans their city and territory, and declared it independent and inviolate against aggression or conquest. Should any such be attempted, the allies present were to help according to their power. Your fathers rewarded us thus for the courage and patriotism that we displayed at that perilous epoch. But you do just the contrary, coming with our bitterest enemies, the Thebans, to enslave us. We appeal therefore to the gods to whom the oaths were then made, to the gods of your ancestors, and lastly to those of our country, and call upon you to refrain from violating our territory or transgressing the oaths, and to let us live independent as Pausanias decreed. The Plataeans had got thus far when they were cut short by Archidamus, saying, There is justice, Plataeans, in what you say, if you act up to your words. According to the grant of Pausanias, continue to be independent yourselves and join in freeing those of your fellow countrymen who, after sharing in the perils of that period, joined in the oaths to you and are now subject to the Athenians. For it is to free them and the rest that all this provision and war has been made. I could wish that you would share our labors and abide by the oaths yourselves. If this is impossible, do what we have already required of you. Remain neutral, enjoying your own. Join neither side, but receive both as friends, neither as allies for the war. Such were the words of Archidamus. The Plataeans, after hearing what he had to say, went into the city and acquainted the people with what had passed, and presently returned for answer that it was impossible for them to do what he proposed, without consulting the Athenians, with whom their children and wives now were. Besides which, they had their fears for the town. After his departure, what was to prevent the Athenians from coming and taking it out of their hands, or the Thebans, who would be included in the oaths, from taking advantage of the proposed neutrality to make a second attempt to seize the city? Upon these points, he tried to reassure them by saying, You have only to deliver over the city and houses to us, Lacedaemonians, to point out the boundaries of your land, the number of your fruit trees, and whatever else can be numerically stated, and yourselves to withdraw wherever you like as long as the war shall last. When it is over, we will restore to you whatever we received, and in the interim hold it in trust and keep it in cultivation, paying you a sufficient allowance. When they had heard what he had to say, they re-entered the city, and after consulting with the people, said that they wished first to acquaint the Athenians with this proposal, and in the event of their approving, to accede to it. In the meantime, they asked him to grant them a truce, and not to lay waste their territory. He accordingly granted a truce for the number of days requisite for the journey, and meanwhile abstained from ravaging their territory. The Plataean envoys went to Athens and consulted with the Athenians, and returned with the following message to those in the city. The Athenians say, Plataeans, that they never hitherto, since we became their allies, on any occasion abandoned us to an enemy, nor will they neglect us now, but will help us according to their ability. And they adjure you by the oaths which your fathers swore to keep the alliance unaltered. On the delivery of this message by the envoys, the Plataeans resolved not to be unfaithful to the Athenians, but to endure, if it must be, seeing their lands laid waste, and any other trials that might come to them, and not to send out again, but to answer from the wall that it was impossible for them to do as the Lacedaemonians proposed. As soon as he had received this answer, King Archidamus proceeded first to make a solemn appeal to the gods and heroes of the country in words following. Ye gods and heroes of the Plataean territory, be my witnesses, that not as aggressors originally, nor until these had first departed from the common oath, did we invade this land, in which our fathers offered you their prayers before defeating the Medes, and which you made auspicious to the Hellenic arms. Nor shall we be aggressors in the measures to which we may now resort, since we have made many fair proposals, but have not been successful. Graciously accord that those who were the first to offend may be punished for it, and that vengeance may be attained by those who would righteously inflict it. After this appeal to the gods, Archidamus put his army in motion. First, he enclosed the town with a palisade formed of the fruit trees which they cut down, to prevent further egress from Plataea. Next, they threw up a mound against the city, hoping that the largeness of the force employed would ensure the speedy reduction of the place. They accordingly cut down timber from Cytheron and built it up on either side, laying it like latticework to serve as a wall to keep the mount from spreading abroad, and carried to it wood and stones and earth and whatever other material might help to complete it. They continued to work at the mount for 70 days and nights without intermission, being divided into relief parties to allow of some being employed in carrying, while others took sleep and refreshment. The Lacedaemonian officer attached to each contingent, keeping the men to the work. But the Plataeans, observing the progress of the mound, constructed a wall of wood and fixed it upon that part of the city wall against which the mound was being erected, and built up bricks inside it, which they took from the neighboring houses. The timber served to bind the building together and to prevent its becoming weak as it advanced in height. It had also a covering of skins and hides, which protected the woodwork against the attacks of burning missiles, and allowed the men to work in safety. Thus, the wall was raised to a great height, and the mount opposite made no less rapid progress. The Plataeans also thought of another expedient. They pulled out part of the wall upon which the mount abutted and carried the earth into the city. Discovering this, the Peloponnesians twisted up clay in wattles of reed and threw it into the breach formed in the mound, in order to give it consistency and prevent its being carried away like the soil. Stopped in this way, the Plataeans changed their mode of operation, and digging a mine from the town, calculated their way under the mound and began to carry off its material as before. This went on for a long while without the enemy outside finding to live out, so that for all they threw on the top, their mound made no progress in proportion, being carried away from beneath and constantly settling down in the vacuum. But the Plataeans, fearing that even thus they might not be able to hold out against the superior numbers of the enemy, had yet another invention. They stopped working at the large building in front of the mound, and starting at either end of it inside from the old low wall, built a new one in the form of a crescent, running in towards the town, in order that, in the event of the great wall being taken, this might remain, and the enemy have to throw up a fresh mound against it, and, as they advanced within, might not only have their trouble again, but also be exposed to missiles on their flanks. While raising the mound, the Peloponnesians also brought up engines against the city, one of which was brought up upon the mound against the great building, and shook down a good piece of it, to the no small alarm of the Plataeans. Others were advanced against different parts of the wall, but were lassoed and broken by the Plataeans, who also hung up great beams by long iron chains from either extremity of 2 poles laid on the wall and projected over it, and drew them up at an angle when any point was threatened by the engine, and, loosing their hold, let the beam go with its chain slack, so that it fell with a run and snapped off the nose of the battering ram. After this, the Peloponnesians, finding that their engines effected nothing, and that their mound was met with the counterwork, concluded that their present means of offense were inadequate to the taking of the city, and prepared for its circumvallation. First, however, they determined to try the effects of fire, and see whether they could not, with the help of a wind, burn the town, as it was not a large one. Indeed, they thought of every possible expedient by which the place might be reduced without the expense of a blockade.
They accordingly brought faggots of brushwood and threw them from the mound, first into the space between it and the wall. And this soon becoming full from the number of hands at work, they next heaped the faggots up as far into the town as they could reach from the top, and then lit the wood by setting fire to it with sulfur and pitch. The consequence was a fire greater than anyone had ever yet seen produced by human agency, though it could not of course be compared to the spontaneous conflagrations sometimes known to occur through the wind rubbing the branches of a mountain forest together. And this fire was not only remarkable for its magnitude, but was also, at the end of so many perils, within an ace of proving fatal to the Plataeans. A great part of the town became entirely inaccessible, and had a wind blown upon it, in accordance with the enemy's hopes, nothing could have saved them. As it was, there is also a story of heavy rain and thunder having come on, by which the fire was put out and the danger averted. Failing in this last attempt, the Peloponnesians left a portion of their forces on the spot, dismissing the rest, and built a wall of circumvallation round the town, dividing the ground among the various cities present, a ditch being made within and without the lines, from which they got their bricks. All being finished by about the rising of Arcturus, they left men enough to man half the wall.
Do you stay at your posts by your ships, and be sharp at catching the word of command? The more so as we are observing one another from so short a distance. And in action, think order and silence all important, qualities useful in war generally, and in naval engagements in particular. And behave before the enemy in a manner worthy of your past exploits. The issues you will fight for are great: to destroy the naval hopes of the Peloponnesians, or to bring nearer to the Athenians their fears for the sea. And I may once more remind you that you have defeated most of them already, and beaten men do not face a danger twice with the same determination. Such was the exhortation of Phormio. The Peloponnesians, finding that the Athenians did not sail into the Gulf and the Narrows in order to lead them in whether they wished it or not, put out at dawn, and forming 4 abreast, sailed inside the Gulf in the direction of their own country, the right wing leading as they had lain at anchor. In this wing were placed 20 of their best sailors, so that in the event of Phormio thinking that their object was now Pactus and coasting along thither to save the place, the Athenians might not be able to escape their onset by getting outside their wing, but might be cut off by the vessels in question. As they expected, Phormio, in alarm for the place, at that moment emptied of its garrison. As soon as he saw them put out, reluctantly and hurriedly embarked and sailed along shore, the Messenian land forces moving along also to support him. The Peloponnesians, seeing him coasting along with his ships in single file, and by this inside the Gulf and close inshore as they so much wished, at one signal tacked suddenly and bore down in line at their best speed on the Athenians, hoping to cut off the whole squadron. The 11 leading vessels, however, escaped the Peloponnesian wing and its sudden movement, and reached the more open water. But the rest were overtaken as they tried to run through, driven ashore and disabled, such of the crews being slain as had not swum out of them. Some of the ships the Peloponnesians lashed to their own, and towed off empty. One they took with the men in it. Others were just being towed off when they were saved by the Messenians dashing into the sea with their armor and fighting from the decks that they had boarded. Thus far victory was with the Peloponnesians, and the Athenian fleet destroyed, the 20 ships in the right wing being meanwhile in chase of the 11 Athenian vessels that had escaped their sudden movement and reached the more open water. These, with the exception of one ship, all outsailed them and got safe into Naupactus, and forming close inshore opposite the temple of Apollo, with their prows facing the enemy, prepared to defend themselves in case the Peloponnesians should sail inshore against them. After a while, the Peloponnesians came up, chanting the paean for their victory as they sailed on, the single Athenian ship remaining being chased by a Leucadian far ahead of the rest. But there happened to be a merchantman lying at anchor in the roadstead, which the Athenian ship found time to sail around, and struck the Leucadian in chase amidships and sank her. An exploit so sudden and unexpected produced a panic among the Peloponnesians, and, having fallen out of order in the excitement of victory, some of them dropped their oars and stopped their way in order to let the main body come up, an unsafe thing to do considering how near they were to the enemy's prows.
while others ran aground in the shallows in their ignorance of the localities. Elated at this incident, the Athenians at one word gave a cheer and dashed at the enemy, who, embarrassed by his mistakes and the disorder in which he found himself, only stood for an instant and then fled for Panormus, whence he had put out. The Athenians, following on his heels, took the 6 vessels nearest them, and recovered those of their own which had been disabled close inshore and taken in tow at the beginning of the action. They killed some of the crews and took some prisoners. On board the Leucadian, which went down off the merchantman, was the Lacedaemonian Timocrates, who killed himself when the ship was sunk and was cast up in the harbor of Naupactus. The Athenians, on their return, set up a trophy on the spot from which they had put out and turned the day, and picking up the wrecks and dead that were on their shore, gave back to the enemy their dead under truce. The Peloponnesians also set up a trophy as victors for the defeat inflicted upon the ships they had disabled inshore, and dedicated the vessel which they had taken at Achaean Rhium side by side with the trophy. After this, apprehensive of the reinforcement expected from Athens, all except the Leucadians sailed into the Chrysaean Gulf for Corinth. Not long after their retreat, the 20 Athenian ships, which were to have joined Phormio before the battle, arrived at Naupactus. Thus the summer ended. Winter was now at hand, but dispersing the fleet, which had retired to Corinth and the Chrysaean Gulf, Cnemus, Brasidas, and the other Peloponnesian captains allowed themselves to be persuaded by the Megarians to make an attempt upon Piraeus, the port of Athens, which, from her decided superiority at sea, had been naturally left unguarded and open. Their plan was as follows. The men were each to take their oar, cushion, and rowlock thong, and, going overland from Corinth to the sea on the Athenian side, to get to Megara as quickly as they could, and launching 40 vessels, which happened to be in the docks at Nicaea, to sail at once to Piraeus. There was no fleet on the lookout in the harbor, and no one had the least idea of the enemy attempting a surprise, while an open attack would, it was thought, never be deliberately ventured on, or, if in contemplation, would be speedily known at Athens. Their plan formed, the next step was to put it in execution. Arriving by night and launching the vessels from Nicaea, they sailed, not to Piraeus as they had originally intended, being afraid of the risk, besides which there was some talk of a wind having stopped them, but to the point of Salamis that looks towards Megara, where there was a fort and a squadron of 3 ships to prevent anything sailing in or out of Megara. This fort they assaulted and towed off the galleys empty, and surprising the inhabitants began to lay waste the rest of the island. Meanwhile, fire signals were raised to alarm Athens, and a panic ensued there as serious as any that occurred during the war. The idea in the city was that the enemy had already sailed into Piraeus. In Piraeus, it was thought that they had taken Salamis and might at any moment arrive in the port, as indeed might easily have been done if their hearts had been a little firmer. Certainly no wind would have prevented them. As soon as day broke, the Athenians assembled in full force, launched their ships, and, embarking in haste and uproar, went with the fleet to Salamis, while their soldiery mounted guard in Piraeus. The Peloponnesians, on becoming aware of the coming relief, after they had overrun most of Salamis, hastily sailed off with their plunder and captives and the 3 ships from Fort Budorum to Nicaea. The state of their ships also causing them some anxiety, as it was a long while since they had been launched, and they were not watertight. Arrived at Megara, they returned back on foot to Corinth. The Athenians, finding them no longer at Salamis, sailed back themselves, and after this made arrangements for guarding Piraeus more diligently in future, by closing the harbors and by other suitable precautions. About the same time, at the beginning of this winter, Sitalces, son of Terus, the Odrysian king of Thrace, made an expedition against Perdiccas, son of Alexander, king of Macedonia, and the Chalcadians in the neighborhood of Thrace. His object was to enforce one promise and fulfill another. On the one hand, Perdiccas had made him a promise, when hard pressed at the commencement of the war, upon condition that Sitalces should reconcile the Athenians to him, and not attempt to restore his brother and enemy, the pretender Philip, but had not offered to fulfill his engagement. On the other, he, Sitalces, on entering into alliance with the Athenians, had agreed to put an end to the Chalcidian War in Thrace. These were the 2 objects of his invasion. With him he brought Amantas, the son of Philip, whom he destined to the throne of Macedonia, and some Athenian envoys then at his court on this business, and Agnon as general, for the Athenians were to join him against the Chalcadians with a fleet and as many soldiers as they could get together. Beginning with the Odrysians, he first called out the Thracian tribes subject to him between Mounts Haemus and Rhodope, and the Euxine and Hellespont. Next, the Geta beyond Haemus, and the other hordes settled south of the Danube in the neighborhood of the Euxine, who, like the Geta, border on the Scythians and are armed in the same manner, being all mounted archers. Besides these, he summoned many of the hill Thracian independent swordsmen, called D, and mostly inhabiting Mount Rhodope, some of whom came as mercenaries, others as volunteers, also the Agrianes and Laodians, and the rest of the Paeonian tribes in his empire, at the confines of which these lay, extending up to the Laodian Paeonians and the river Strymon, which flows from Mount Scombrus through the country of the Agrianes and Laodians. Bordering on the Triballe, also independent, were the Trarus and Tilitaeans, who dwell to the north of Mount Scombrus and extend towards the setting sun as far as the river Oscius. This river rises in the same mountains as the Nestus and Hebrus, a wild and extensive range connected with Rhodope. The empire of the Odrysians extended along the seaboard from Abdera to the mouth of the Danube in the Euxine. The navigation of this coast by the shortest route takes a merchantman 4 days and 4 nights with a wind astern the whole way. By land, an active man, traveling by the shortest road, can get from Abdera to the Danube in 11 days. Such was the length of its coastline. Inland from Byzantium to the Laodians and the Strymon, the farthest limit of its extension into the interior, it is a journey of 13 days for an active man. The tribute from all the barbarian districts and the Hellenic cities, taking what they brought in under Seuthes, the successor of Sitalces, who raised it to its greatest height, amounted to about 400 talents in gold and silver. There were also presents in gold and silver to a no less amount, besides stuff plain and embroidered, and other articles made not only for the king, but also for the Odrysian lords and nobles. For there was here established a custom opposite to that prevailing in the Persian kingdom, namely of taking rather than giving.